This is video lecture 8 on John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and in this last video lecture, I want to talk about some potential complications and perhaps objections to Mill. Now, if you remember, Mill's official line, his one very simple principle states that the only justification for limiting the liberty of anyone is to prevent harm to others, and Mill is clear about this. For example, he says that your own good, either moral or physical, is not a sufficient warrant for limiting your liberty. So what we said even way back in video lecture number 1 is that Mill is pretty clearly opposed to the doctrine of paternalism. Now, we haven't talked about paternalism in a great deal. We'll talk about paternalism more in the next few weeks. But recall what paternalism is. According to paternalism, your liberty can be limited for your own good, not to keep you from harming others, but perhaps to prevent you from harming yourself, or perhaps to confer a benefit upon you, to force a benefit upon you, even if it's a benefit you claim you don't want. So officially, Mill's party line view is he rejects paternalism. What's curious, though, is that we see a couple places, and this shows up again in chapter 5, where it's not so clear that Mill can really say that consistently with what he wants to say about a couple particular issues. So one of the sort of more famous places where Mill says things excuse me, that feels kind of paternalistic, is that a word? That kind of feels like Mill is talking like a paternalist, is in paragraph 5 of chapter 5. Let's call this Mill's bridge. It's in these circumstances. Mill wants us to imagine that a public officer, or really anyone else, saw a person attempting to cross a bridge. And by the way, we know that that bridge is unsafe. It is going to collapse. They are going to fall into some rushing waters below if they cross that bridge, and they're going to get hurt. If there is no time to warn you of the danger, we might seize you and turn you back without any infringement of a person's liberty. This should be a little bit surprising because pretty clearly what I'm doing when I say tackle you or refuse to let you to cross the bridge, I'm limiting your liberty. But I'm emphatically not limiting your liberty to prevent you from harming someone else. Surely I am keeping you from crossing that bridge for your own good. It's hard to see how the harm principle alone could justify restricting your liberty in those circumstances. It seems like we need some kind of paternalism there. How is Mill going to explain all this? Well, notice what Mill says towards the end. What is liberty for Mill? Liberty consists in doing what you desire, and no one desires to fall in the river. So if I keep you, apparently, trying to trace out this line of thought logically, if I keep you from doing something that you yourself don't really want to do, then I haven't limited your liberty. Now, again, how this is exactly supposed to square with the harm principle is a little bit unclear. Is the idea that there's like a real you and a fake you who has these false beliefs about what's going on, and I'm keeping fake you from harming real you? That's sort of metaphysically implausible, kind of hard to understand. We do sometimes talk about that when it comes to drug addicts, though. We sometimes talk about the drug addict's real self, what she really, really wants, namely to kick the habit, as opposed to her drug-addled self who just wants to get high. We do sometimes talk about saving people from themselves, but whether Mill can really talk like that is a bit of an open question. Keep in mind, though, this is not the only place where Mill is going to say things that are kind of problematic paternalistic. You might be able to get by with the bridge, but keep in mind, one of the things that we see in chapter 5 that Mill is extremely hesitant to permit is something like an unrequited liberty of contract. Unrequited liberty of contract. What Mill sort of thinks is that we should not permit, or at the very least, we should allow the state to cancel or annul contracts that people made in the past. Why? Because something that you might agree to now might not be something that you want in 5, 10, 20, 50 years. Circumstances have changed. You might have changed, in which case what you're agreeing to now might be very disastrous for you later. So for someone like Mill, with respect to contracts, quite generally, it's not that Mill thought you could engage in contracts, but he did think that there should be some kind of legal mechanism for getting out of them. Now, You might wonder exactly in what sense then we really still have contracts anymore, and I think that's actually a good question. We would treat contracts quite generally in the way that we seem to treat marriage, at least in the United States. There are some circumstances in which people can get a divorce and have some analog of a contract dissolved. There are some circumstances in which the marriage is simply annulled and has the effect of never having taken place, quite generally. All contracts for someone like Mill would kind of need to be like that, precisely because by signing a contract right now, you might be harming yourself later on. Again, it's a little hard to understand how that could be justifiable given what Mill says in his one very simple principle. Because insofar as I'm giving you a kind of legal power to get out of a contract later, that seems to be something I'm doing for your own good. But that's also something that limits your liberty right now. Maybe right now what you want to do is sign an unbreakable contract for the rest of your life. Now you can't do it. So that too is a kind of limitation of your liberty that doesn't seem like we can justify by Mill's one very simple principle. One of the most remarkable cases of Mill being some kind of a paternalist, and there's been a lot of philosophical ink spilled on this, is the topic of what we'll call voluntary slavery. I don't mean to talk about slavery in the remainder of this lecture. The kind of slavery that was practiced in the Americas, where blacks and African Americans were literally enslaved and forced into servitude in the United States, for example. Voluntary slavery is, well, voluntary. In cases of voluntary slavery, a person voluntarily, absent coercion, for whatever reason, sells themselves into slavery and becomes the chattel slave of another person. The effect of this is to abdicate your right of self-ownership. If you remember, in video lecture 6, we talked about Mill being a kind of libertarian, and libertarians generally endorse a very strong right of self-ownership, a right that would imply that you have the right to do with your body and person whatever you have to do with rights of with your private property quite generally, including selling it, trading it, or simply destroying it altogether. Mill doesn't seem very comfortable with this. In fact, Mill is going to deny that we should have the right to sell ourselves into voluntary slavery. Now, why might a person want to sell themselves into voluntary slavery? It's kind of hard to imagine real-life cases. Then again, maybe it's not. Imagine that I have a child who has just a terrible chronic illness. She's in great pain, she's going to die, and the only treatments that promise any relief are incredibly, incredibly expensive, like millions of dollars. The only way I can come up with that money is if I agree to sell myself as a slave to a really, really rich guy. The rich guy is very clear of the terms, right? Part of the point of signing up a contract to be a voluntary slave is that it is irrevocable. You cannot go back. I decide it's worth it. This is how much I love my kid. This is how much I need the money. I will sign up to be someone's slave to save her life. Maybe that's just a great parent. I don't know that that's crazy. In any case, Mill thinks that is inconsistent with taking liberty and autonomy seriously that we allow anybody to be a voluntary slave. Here's Mill. In this and most other civilized countries, an engagement by which a person should sell himself or allow himself to be sold as a slave would be null and void. And Mill thinks that's a good thing. We should have laws that forbid voluntary slavery. But why? Again, it seems like the most obvious person who benefits from a law that forbids voluntary slavery is the person who wanted to sell themselves. We're not preventing you from harming other people by selling yourself into slavery. We're preventing you from harming yourself. It's for your own good, and that feels like paternalism. Notice what Mill says here. And again, this is a really puzzling thing, and there's been a bunch of philosophical ink spilled on it. By selling himself for a slave, he abdicates his liberty. He foregoes any future use of it beyond that single act. He therefore defeats, in his own case, the very purpose which is the justification of allowing him to dispose of himself. To talk a little more briefly, apparently, if Mill's right, taking liberty seriously does not mean that we have to allow you to destroy your liberty. Prizing autonomy means that we don't let you destroy your capacities for autonomy. In particular, we don't let you abdicate your liberty by exercising it and signing up to be a voluntary slave. Now, whether this is something we can really make sense of or not is an interesting philosophical question. There are plenty of contemporary libertarians who are sort of concerned that Mill's just plain wrong here and do think that if we really do have this strong right of self-ownership, then we have to allow people to be voluntary slaves. What's curious for Mill is that he's on the other side of that debate. And this is a project for Mill scholars. It seems like you can say one of two things. Either you can say Mill is just inconsistent on these points, that sometimes he seems to say that paternalism is wrong, but then in these places and perhaps a few others that we've been talking about in this video lecture, he just contradicts himself. A more interesting project for a Mill scholar is to explain how what Mill says about his one very simple principle is consistent with what he says about the bridge, about contracts, and about selling yourself into slavery quite generally. Can Mill's libertarianism be combined with some kind of paternalism? It's a fascinating question for Mill scholars and one that should keep you awake at night.